So coin, by virtue of the treatment it received from the state and its appeal to people, became money, right? Coin, not obviously money until it's treated as such by the state. Eventually, the state regularized the practice by which it made coin. It offered coin for sale to those bringing in money to the mint. If you brought in silver bullion, you would get back coin. Of course, the state would charge you. It would make all of your bullion into coin, and it would keep a few of those coins. But it would be worth it to you, even though you weren't getting back the full amount of metal you'd brought in. It would be worth it to you because the coin you got back was worth more than simple metal. It was worth more because it had all the properties we just talked about. Right? So you could pay the state with it, you could transfer it to other people, you could use it to measure goods with the nice regular standard that it offered. In short, it was money. Coin was money, and money offered a liquidity that made it more valuable than plain metal. How did people conceive of this thing legally? Coin was generally categorized as property. You had paid for it, after all, when you bought it from the state. Its content was a commodity. That also seemed like property and had been treated as such before you converted it. You could pass it on, give it away, alienate it. That's what made it transferable. It was accepted by the state as an asset you owed for taxes. That's why everyone else accepted it in payment also. But, and here's the interesting feature about this early kind of money, it was conditional property because it had constantly to be adjusted in order to remain viable. And here we have to get technical for a second. Recall the aim, the goal of creating a unit of account, right, a regular measure. Maintaining that standard requires ensuring that it applies uniformly in different contexts and that there is parity across different denominations or forms of currency. That seemingly simple mandate is actually an enormously complex enterprise, one that draws heavily upon public capacity. So medieval and early modern governments, even when operating in utter good faith, regularly ran into crises that they could only navigate, or they could most obviously navigate, by debasing or devaluing their coin supply. So another moment on this somewhat technical problem to explain it a bit. Early coin, which is apparently so blunt and simple, so solid, was actually an incredibly fragile money. Its perennial difficulty followed from the very commodity content that seemed to secure it, right? The fact that it's made of metal, which seems to make it so stable. Coin was designed to travel in different denominations, each carrying an amount of silver or gold proportionate to its value in the hierarchy of coin. But the relationship between the metal content of coin and the value it carried as money was extremely hard to maintain. So coin, for example, to take the easiest example, and also one of the most perennial and troublesome, coin wears down as it passes from hand to hand. As they got older, silver pennies became lighter and lighter compared to new issues, which circulated at full metal weight. Recognizing that they could always melt coin or export the bullion if the price for metal was high enough, users hoarded the new coin, right, the heavier stuff, and passed off the old coin that had worn down. So small change, the very currency most necessary in everyday life, was the most vulnerable. These are the silver pennies, paradigmatically. Shortages and scarcities haunted the medieval period, shortages of small change. One of the most effective ways to correct the distortions of relative value introduced by wear and tear was to debase new coinage. Reducing the amount of metal in it brought it into parity with older coins. Debasement worked as well to correct other problems, like the distortions created by other events, like the changing price on the commodity markets of silver and gold, right? If the price changed, then the place where your coin fell in the hierarchy would be distorted, and it would throw off the relative worth of silver, say, to gold coin. Scholars long ago flagged how frequently medieval governments debased their money supplies, but they wrote off that behavior as abusive. More often, in fact, public authorities diluted the metal content of certain coin in order to restore its precarious balance with the rest of the money supply. So here we can understand why coin while categorized as property, had to be property conditioned on public need. Officials needed to explain and justify their intervention. It was hard for people otherwise to tell illegitimate from legitimate debasements, and the illegitimate ones did occur at times when rulers just wanted to get revenue from the coin. In debate with contemporaries who variously understood or resisted them, officials minted a language that conditioned private right upon public need and emphasized sovereign authority to act in protection of a common resource. So, for example, when Elizabeth I debased her money, her judges, this came up in the common law courts, declared that a certain standard of money, this is the unit of account function, was absolutely necessary for exchange to occur, and the king, therefore, had to keep that standard. Therefore, here's the language that conditions property, ultimately and emphatically. As they put it, he may change his money in substance and impression and enhance or debase the value of it, or entirely decry and annul it, so that it shall be but bullion at his pleasure. In such circumstances, money coherently figured as an asset, but an asset subject to management by authorities. Its very viability depended on chronic intervention. Here, a last point. At the most basic level, money remains conditional in every regime that I've looked at. Here's a case from 1935 where the U.S. famously devalued gold coin, and a holder objected. Here's what the court says. Conceding the title of the owner of such coins, yet there is attached to such ownership those limitations which public policy may require by reason of their quality as a legal tender and as a medium of exchange. So Congress there had acted to stop the export of gold after a run on the banks. This is the middle of the Depression. The devaluation of coin and the prohibition of exporting gold coin were necessary to protect the very function of money, right? The very function of gold as money. The government, in other words, had created money as a working medium, and it had to act as necessary to protect that very function. Having said that, coin by 1935 was not a common currency, that is gold coin. It was a reserve that animated another currency. And that other currency consisted of banknotes or fiduciary money. A whole different paradigm applied to that money, and that was the money used in everyday life. The occasion for the change, this change to fiduciary money, was the popularization of public borrowing, the invention of the bond, as a device that could be used to borrow widely from citizens who lent to the government. So the bonds are first invented by government for public borrowing. Bonds were promissory notes pledging repayment of a certain amount of money, the coin we already know about. In other words, bonds were unambiguously contracts that identified also unambiguously the face value of a monetary obligation as the relative mandate. So the English begin experimenting with these new designs for public borrowing in the 1660s. That experience informed even more dramatic initiatives in the 1690s. Bank of England notes began to circulate in that decade, and they were based on the same kind of fiduciary pledge to repay money, to repay gold, that had secured bonds. These banknotes would become enormously important in the following century, so in the 18th century. Why? They supplemented the scant money supply, a supply that was increasingly under strain given a growing population and an increasingly urban population. The money supply, as economists would tell us, could, of course, have handled this population, but only with severe deflation. Instead, if you could increase the amount of money in circulation, you could avoid that kind of deflation. So banknotes supplemented the metal supply in paper. And that medium, by the way, did not import with it, all the problems of commodity valuation that had bedeviled money, right? All the ones that we just talked about. Finally, banknotes provided a way for banks to profit, right? They made money on the creation of liquidity.